They say the body is the vessel, but the mind is the captain steering the ship. When you look at history, at science, at spiritual traditions across cultures, one truth shines through again and again. Our mind holds the power to either create our suffering or unlock our freedom. Think about it. Two people can face the exact same situation, yet one breaks under pressure while the other rises, grows, even transforms pain into wisdom. The difference isn't luck, wealth, or physical strength. The difference is the mind. Your mind is not just a tool for solving problems or remembering facts. It's the lens through which you experience reality. If the lens is clouded with fear, anger, or doubt, even the most beautiful day feels heavy. But if the lens is clear, polished with mindfulness, gratitude, and inner calm, you begin to see beauty even in hardship, purpose even in loss. That is the silent power of the mind. It creates the world you live in. The Buddha once taught that we are shaped by our thoughts, we become what we think. Modern neuroscience confirms this. Every thought you repeat strengthens pathways in the brain, carving grooves like rivers shaping stone. Positive thoughts create resilience, compassion, clarity. Negative ones carve out anxiety, resentment, despair. And here lies the most empowering truth: you are not helpless. You can train the mind. Just as you would train a muscle at the gym, you can train your awareness, your focus, your inner strength. But let's be honest. Most of us were never taught how to use this power. We were taught math, history, science, but not how to deal with fear when it strikes at midnight. Not how to quiet the storm of worry when life spins out of control. Not how to heal the wounds of the heart without running to distractions. And so the mind often runs wild, dragging us into stress, loneliness, or endless chasing after things that never satisfy. This is where the wisdom of Buddhism, especially Zen, becomes like a lantern in the dark. It doesn't tell you to run away from life or escape its challenges. Instead, it shows you how to meet life fully, calm in the middle of chaos, centered in the middle of change, compassionate in the middle of conflict. When you understand the mind and how to guide it, you stop being a prisoner of your thoughts and begin to live as their master. Now, imagine for a moment. What if you could wake up tomorrow and feel light, even when your problems haven't disappeared? What if you could carry peace in your heart no matter what storms life throws your way? That is not fantasy. It's the real promise of a trained mind. And this journey we're about to take together is not just about learning philosophy. It's about experiencing this transformation for yourself. In the chapters ahead, we'll explore how the mind shapes reality, how hidden patterns hold us back, and how ancient Buddhist wisdom can guide us into deeper healing, peace, and strength. But before diving into techniques and teachings, let's pause here at the threshold of the journey and remember this simple truth. The greatest treasure you'll ever discover is not out there in the world. It's within you, waiting in the power of your own mind. We've just opened the door to the incredible power of the mind, but here's the truth. The mind never works alone. It is inseparable from the body. They move together like two dancers, each influencing the other's every step. When the mind is restless, the body tightens. When the body is exhausted, the mind struggles to stay calm. The relationship is so intimate that scientists and sages alike describe them not as two separate entities, but as one living, breathing system. Think about the last time you felt anxious. Did your heart beat faster? Did your stomach twist into knots? That wasn't just in your head. Your thoughts triggered real physical reactions: adrenaline, muscle tension, shallow breath. Now flip the picture. Remember a time you were deeply relaxed, maybe sitting by the ocean or listening to music you love. Your body softened, your shoulders dropped, your breath slowed. Suddenly, the mind felt lighter, clearer, more open. This is the body-mind connection in action. Modern medicine calls it the psychosomatic link. Ancient Buddhism simply calls it life itself. The Buddha understood over 500 years ago that the body and mind are reflections of each other. That's why meditation is never just a mental practice. It always begins with the body, watching the breath, noticing sensations, relaxing tension. Because when the body softens, the mind follows. And when the mind steadies, the body heals. One of the most striking examples of this connection is how chronic stress impacts health. Doctors today confirm what Buddhists have taught for centuries. A restless, worried mind can weaken the immune system, disturb digestion, raise blood pressure, even shorten lifespan. But here's the good news. The reverse is equally true. A calm, centered mind can strengthen immunity, balance hormones, regulate the heart, and restore vitality. The body listens to every whisper of the mind. You may have heard stories of monks sitting in freezing mountains, their bodies radiating warmth simply through meditation. This isn't magic. It's mastery of the body-mind connection. By calming the mind and directing focus, they influence the nervous system, the heartbeat, even body temperature. Science has now studied this phenomenon, Tummo meditation, and confirmed what once seemed impossible. It shows us that within this connection lies untapped potential we all carry. But you don't need to be a monk in the Himalayas to feel this truth. The connection reveals itself in small ways every single day. When you pause to take 3 slow breaths during stress, and suddenly your mind feels less cluttered, that's the body-mind link at work. When you stretch in the morning and your mood shifts from dull to energized, that's it too. The simple movements of the body echo in the corridors of the mind. And here's something even deeper. The body carries memories the mind tries to forget. Trauma, grief, unspoken fears. These often live in the body long after the conscious mind moves on. A clenched jaw, a heavy chest, a restless leg. These are silent signals of unresolved emotions. Buddhist mindfulness invites us to meet these signals not with judgment but with gentle attention. When you breathe into the tension, when you sit with discomfort without running away, healing begins. So, why does this matter for our journey? Because if we truly want to harness the power of the mind, we cannot ignore the body. They are partners in transformation. A restless body breeds a restless mind. A peaceful body invites a peaceful mind. And when both work in harmony, life begins to flow differently. You feel stronger, clearer, more resilient, more alive. As we continue forward, keep this truth close. Your body is not just a shell carrying the mind around. It is a sacred gateway, a mirror, a teacher. Learning to listen to it, honor it, and align it with the mind will open the path to healing, joy, and profound inner freedom. The body and mind are inseparable partners, and when they move in harmony, a doorway opens to something even greater, balance. Balance is not just a lifestyle trend, not just about working less or eating right. It is a timeless principle that governs everything, our health, our relationships, our happiness, even the flow of nature itself. Look around you. The sun rises and sets. The tides rise and fall. The seasons shift from growth to rest. All of life breathes in rhythm. And we, as human beings, are no different. When we live in tune with this rhythm, there is a sense of ease. But when we push too far, too much work, too little rest, too much desire, too little gratitude, we fall out of balance. The result is stress, illness, emptiness, or the nagging sense that something is missing. Think of balance as the middle path the Buddha spoke of. He discovered it after years of extremes, first indulging in luxury as a prince, then punishing his body with harsh ascetic practices. Neither brought freedom. What opened the way was balance, not clinging to pleasure, not clinging to pain, but walking the middle path of awareness, moderation, and wisdom. This is not weakness. It is strength, the kind of strength that comes from steadiness, not from struggle. Now ask yourself, where does imbalance show up in your life? Maybe it's the endless chase for success, working until your body begs for rest. Maybe it's in relationships, giving so much that you forget yourself, or holding back so much that love never has space to grow. Maybe it's in your own heart, caught between clinging to the past and fearing the future, never resting in the calm of the present. Finding balance doesn't mean living a perfect life. It means learning how to return when you drift too far. Just as a tightrope walker sways from side to side but always comes back to center, we too can train ourselves to notice imbalance and gently guide ourselves back. This is why mindfulness is so powerful. It shines a light on where we lean too heavily, on food, on comfort, on control, on approval, and reminds us to step back into center. Here's a simple truth. Balance is less about what you do and more about how you do it. Eating a meal can be mindless consumption or a practice of gratitude. Working late can be self-destruction or an act of dedication, depending on whether you're guided by awareness or by craving. Balance is not found in rules, it's found in wisdom, in knowing when to move forward and when to rest, when to hold on and when to let go. And let's not forget, balance also means harmony between body and mind, as we explored before. When your body is cared for but your mind is neglected, imbalance grows. When your mind is sharp but your body is ignored, imbalance grows. True balance embraces both, weaving them together into a life that feels whole. Imagine your life as a garden. If you only water one corner, the rest withers. If you flood the soil, nothing thrives. But when water, sunlight, and care are balanced, the garden blooms. Your life is no different, work and rest, giving and receiving, effort and ease, silence and speech. These pairs are not enemies, they are partners, each one giving meaning to the other. When balance becomes your way of living, life feels less like a constant battle and more like a gentle rhythm. You don't burn out chasing what you can't control. You don't sink into despair when things fall apart. Instead, you find yourself steady, grounded, and alive, ready to meet each moment with clarity. And as we journey forward, we'll discover that balance is not just a principle for daily living. It's also the foundation of healing. Because only when body and mind rest in balance can awareness open fully and guide us into deeper transformation. Balance gives us stability, but true peace comes when we step fully into the present moment. The mind loves to wander, chasing after what's next, replaying what's already gone. It's like living in a house but never actually being home. And yet home is always here. The present moment is where life is happening. It is the only place where joy, love, and healing can truly exist. Think about how often the mind pulls you away. You might be eating, but already worrying about tomorrow. You might be with loved ones, but your mind is lost in the past. In those moments, you are physically present, but spiritually absent. The tragedy is that life itself slips through unnoticed, like water running through open hands. The Buddha once compared this to carrying a lamp in the dark. When your awareness is with the present, you walk with light. When your awareness drifts into past or future, you stumble in shadow. The past cannot be changed. The future has not yet arrived. Only here, only now can you truly live. Modern science echoes this wisdom. Psychologists call it mind wandering and find that the more our minds drift, the less happy we feel. Even if the day is calm, if the mind is elsewhere, we feel restless. But when attention anchors in the present, whether to the breath, a sound, a task, or a loved one, the heart feels lighter, more at ease. Living in the present moment doesn't mean ignoring responsibility or never planning ahead. It means bringing full awareness to what is happening as it unfolds. Washing dishes becomes a meditation when you feel the water, hear the clink of the bowl, smell the soap. Walking becomes a meditation when you feel each step on the earth, notice the breeze on your skin, hear the rhythm of your breath. The ordinary transforms into extraordinary simply because you are awake to it. And here's something subtle yet powerful. The present moment is where suffering softens. Anxiety is born from imagining what could go wrong in the future. Regret is born from clinging to what's already gone. But when the mind rests in the now, neither regret nor anxiety can take hold. There is only the clarity of what is, and in that clarity, peace arises naturally. This doesn't mean the present is always comfortable. Sometimes it's painful, illness, grief, loss. But even here, the present holds freedom. When you stay with the breath during pain, when you meet sorrow with full awareness, you discover that pain is just a wave. It rises, it falls, it changes. The mind stories, this will last forever, I cannot bear it, are what create suffering. Awareness strips away the story and reveals the truth. Everything passes. Living in the present moment also deepens connection. Imagine sitting with a friend who truly listens, not checking their phone, not rushing you, but giving full attention. You feel seen, valued, understood. Now imagine being that friend offering presents to others. That kind of presence is the greatest gift you can give, and it starts by learning to offer it to yourself. So how do we begin? The path is simple. Return again and again. When the mind drifts, notice. Gently guide it back to the breath, to the body, to the here and now. No judgment, no struggle, just return. Over time, the present moment begins to feel less like a stranger you visit occasionally and more like the home you never want to leave. And here is the beautiful truth. When you live in the present, you discover that you already have what you've been chasing. Peace is not hidden in the future. Joy is not buried in the past. Both are right here, waiting in this very breath. As we move forward, we'll see how this presence, this gentle awareness, becomes the key not only to peace but to healing itself. Healing the mind, the body, and the heart at the deepest level. Living in the present moment awakens clarity, but clarity is only the beginning. Once the light of awareness shines, it reveals not only peace and beauty, but also the parts of ourselves we often try to avoid, the fears, the wounds, the habits we've hidden in the dark. To walk the path of transformation, we must learn to face ourselves honestly. This is not easy. Most people spend their lives running away from themselves. We bury pain under distractions, numb discomfort with noise, chase achievement to cover insecurity. On the surface, it may look like success, but inside there's a quiet restlessness, a voice we don't want to hear. The Buddha once said, "It is better to conquer yourself than to win 1,000 battles." And what is self-conquest if not the courage to look in the mirror of truth? Facing yourself honestly doesn't mean criticizing or punishing yourself. It means seeing yourself clearly, with all your light and all your shadows. It's admitting when you are afraid instead of pretending you're strong. It's acknowledging anger instead of hiding behind a smile. It's recognizing the desires that drive you, the attachments that bind you, the illusions that cloud your vision. Honesty is not about judgment, it's about freedom. Because what you refuse to face will always control you, but what you face with awareness loses its power. Consider how we often blame the world for our suffering. If only others treated me better, if only life gave me more, if only circumstances were different. But when you look deeply, you see that much of the suffering arises not from life itself, but from how the mind clings, resists, or distorts reality. To face yourself honestly is to admit, the storm is not always outside. Sometimes it lives within me. And that admission, though difficult, is the seed of transformation. Psychologists today call this radical acceptance. It means looking at yourself without denial. If there is pain, you say, "Yes, there is pain." If there is anger, you admit, "Yes, anger is here." If there is longing, you whisper, "Yes, I see you." Buddhism teaches the same through mindfulness. Name the feeling, breathe with it, and watch it as it rises and falls. When you stop running, you realize that no emotion, no fear, no story is permanent. But honesty also requires compassion. Many people hear the word honest and think of harsh criticism. I must see all my flaws. But honesty without compassion becomes cruelty. The Buddha compared the mind to a garden. If you discover weeds, do you scream at the soil? Of course not. You simply see the weeds, acknowledge them, and gently remove them while continuing to nurture the flowers. In the same way, when you face yourself, you do so with patience, tenderness, and care. Here's the paradox. The more you avoid yourself, the heavier life feels. But the moment you dare to face what you've been hiding, the burden begins to lift. It's like opening a window in a dark, stuffy room. Fresh air rushes in. Light fills the space. You realize the monster in the shadows was never as big as your fear made it seem. And here is the gift. When you face yourself honestly, you also discover your strength. Beneath the layers of fear and doubt lies resilience. Beneath the habits and wounds lies wisdom. Beneath the stories you tell yourself lies your true nature, vast, luminous, unshakable. Facing yourself is not about finding flaws, it's about uncovering the truth of who you really are. So as we continue this journey, remember, honesty is not the enemy, it is the doorway. The more courageously you face yourself, the freer you become. And with that freedom comes the ability to live not in fear, not in denial, but in wholeness. And from this wholeness, something remarkable begins to unfold, the art of letting go. Because once you see clearly what weighs you down, you can finally release it and walk lighter into the life you were meant to live. When we dare to face ourselves honestly, something else becomes clear. Every thought, every word, every action carries consequences. Nothing exists in isolation. Just as a pebble dropped into a pond creates ripples that reach the farthest shore, the choices we make shape not only our own lives but the lives of those around us. And with that truth comes responsibility. Responsibility is not a punishment. It is the natural law of cause and effect, the very heartbeat of karma. When the mind is filled with anger, harsh words follow and suffering spreads. When the mind is rooted in compassion, kind actions bloom and joy multiplies. This isn't about superstition, it's about reality. Every seed you plant in thought and action will one day bear fruit. The question is, what kind of garden are you growing? Most of us resist responsibility because we mistake it for blame. We think if I take responsibility, it means I'm at fault. But responsibility is not about shame. It is about freedom. To accept responsibility means to recognize that you are not a victim of life. You are an active participant. You may not control every event, but you do control how you meet it, how you respond, how you shape the story that follows. Consider this. Two people face the same loss. One clings to bitterness, drowning in resentment. The other turns pain into compassion, reaching out to comfort others. The event was the same, but the consequences differ because of choice. Responsibility is the bridge between what happens to you and what grows from it. The Buddha taught this through the law of dependent origination. Everything arises because of conditions, and those conditions create further conditions. It's like lighting a candle from another, flame after flame, one moment shaping the next. When you recognize this chain, you see that your actions today are shaping tomorrow. Your words today are carving memories in someone's heart. Your thoughts today are forming the reality you will wake up to. But responsibility doesn't have to feel heavy. In fact, it can feel empowering. Because once you accept it, you no longer wait helplessly for life to change. You become the one who changes it. You stop asking, "Why is this happening to me?" and begin asking, "What can I create with what's here?" That shift alone turns suffering into possibility. Think about the choices you've made recently. Did they bring you closer to balance or further from it? Did they nourish peace or fuel restlessness? Responsibility invites us to pause, reflect, and redirect if needed. It is never too late to plant better seeds. Even the most tangled garden can bloom again if you begin tending it today. And here's the deeper truth. Responsibility also means owning the power of your presence. A kind smile can change a stranger's day. A word of encouragement can spark someone's courage. A moment of mindfulness can stop a chain of anger from spreading. Small acts ripple outward in ways we may never see, but they matter. They matter more than we realize. Living with responsibility means living with awareness of those ripples. It means asking yourself before you speak, will these words heal or harm? Before you act, will this bring peace or suffering? Before you dwell on a thought, is this the seed I want to water? This isn't about perfection, it's about intention. And intention, when nurtured with care, reshapes everything. So, as we move forward, let's carry this truth. Every choice writes a line in the story of your life. Every action sends ripples across the pond of existence. When you face yourself honestly and embrace responsibility, you stop drifting through life. You begin steering it with wisdom, compassion, and courage. And this naturally leads us to the next step in our journey, understanding impermanence. Because if consequences shape our lives, impermanence reminds us why each choice, each moment matters so deeply. When we begin to take responsibility for our choices, the path of transformation opens wide. But very quickly we discover something else. The mind does not always cooperate. Even when we want to live with clarity, peace, and compassion, there are forces within us that pull in the opposite direction. In Buddhism, these are called the Five Hindrances. They are like veils covering the mind, clouds that obscure the sun, obstacles that keep us from living fully awake. The first hindrance is desire, the restless craving for pleasure, comfort, or distraction. Desire whispers, "If only I had this, I'd be happy." But the moment you grasp it, the satisfaction fades and a new craving takes its place. It's like drinking salt water. The more you drink, the thirstier you become. Desire blinds us to the richness of the present moment because it convinces us happiness lies somewhere else. The second hindrance is aversion, the resistance, anger, or irritation that rises when life doesn't go our way. Aversion builds walls in the heart, shutting out compassion and replacing it with bitterness. When aversion dominates, even small frustrations feel unbearable and peace seems impossible. It's like holding a burning coal, hoping to throw it at someone else, yet the one who gets burned is always you. The third hindrance is sloth and torpor, that heavy fog of laziness or dullness that keeps us stuck. It's not true rest, but a kind of lifeless drifting, where the body feels heavy and the mind sinks into numbness. This hindrance steals vitality and prevents growth, keeping us asleep when life is calling us to wake. The fourth hindrance is restlessness and worry, the constant agitation of the mind, leaping from thought to thought, never settling. Restlessness makes it hard to focus, hard to breathe, hard to simply be. Worry keeps dragging the mind into what if, spinning endless stories of fear. Together they scatter our energy until peace feels out of reach. And the fifth hindrance is doubt, the voice that questions not with curiosity but with paralysis. Can I really do this? Does this path even work? Am I strong enough? Doubt weakens resolve and keeps us circling in hesitation, never moving forward. It is like standing at the edge of a river, too unsure to step in, watching life flow by without ever crossing. Each of these hindrances is natural. They are part of the human condition. But left unchecked, they become barriers to freedom. They distort reality, pulling us into craving, fear, dullness, restlessness, or uncertainty. And here's the key. The hindrances are not enemies to be destroyed, but teachers to be understood. When desire arises, we learn to notice it without chasing it. When aversion flares, we breathe into it instead of feeding the fire. When dullness appears, we bring energy, perhaps by adjusting the body, opening the eyes, or remembering our purpose. When restlessness takes over, we ground ourselves in the breath, letting thoughts settle like dust in still water. When doubt whispers, we return to experience, trusting what we have seen, felt, and lived, rather than clinging to endless questions. In this way, the hindrances become mirrors. They reveal where the mind is stuck, where healing is needed, where practice must deepen. And when we meet them with awareness, they lose their grip. The clouds part, the sun shines again, and the mind becomes spacious, radiant, alive. Recognizing the hindrances is like clearing weeds from a garden. Only when they are removed can the flowers of wisdom, compassion, and peace bloom freely. And this brings us closer to one of the most liberating insights of Buddhism, the truth of impermanence. Because when we see that even the hindrances are not permanent, we realize we are never trapped. Change is always possible. Freedom is always near. There are three poisons that quietly eat away at the human heart. They don't knock on your door. They don't announce their arrival, but they slip in silently and leave behind a storm. Ill will, anger, and jealousy. If left unchecked, these forces can shape your destiny in ways you never imagined, because they don't just harm others, they destroy you from the inside first. Think about ill will, those lingering thoughts of resentment or the silent wish for someone else's downfall. It's like carrying around a burning coal in your hand, hoping it will burn the other person. But the truth is, you are the one who gets scorched. Every time you feed ill will, you drain your own energy, poison your own mind, and reinforce suffering. Then there is anger. Anger is hot, explosive, and intoxicating. For a brief moment, it feels powerful, but afterwards, it leaves exhaustion, regret, and sometimes irreversible damage. Anger blinds us, pulling us away from wisdom and clarity. Imagine a lake stirred by violent winds. The water becomes muddy and you cannot see the reflection of the sky above. In the same way, anger clouds the mind, making it impossible to see truth, to act with compassion, or to choose the right path. And what about jealousy? That subtle whisper that says, "Why them and not me?" Jealousy corrodes joy. It takes what could be an opportunity for inspiration and turns it into bitterness. Instead of letting someone else's success lift us higher, jealousy locks us in chains of comparison, telling us we are never enough. But here's the secret. Jealousy is nothing more than the mind's way of forgetting your own worth. The Buddha taught that these poisons do not have to control us. When ill will arises, you can counter it with loving kindness, deliberately sending thoughts of goodwill, even to those you dislike. When anger surges, you can pause, breathe deeply, and remind yourself that reacting in fury is like drinking poison and hoping the other person dies. And when jealousy creeps in, you can shift your perspective. Instead of resenting another's blessings, you can see them as proof that abundance is possible for you too. You see, the true danger is not in these emotions appearing. They will appear. The danger lies in identifying with them, letting them dictate your words and actions. Mastery comes when you notice them like passing storms, real, intense, but temporary. When you don't cling to them, they dissolve. Imagine the freedom of a heart not bound by ill will. Imagine the peace of a mind unshaken by anger. Imagine the joy of celebrating others' success without jealousy. That is the path of liberation. And the more you walk it, the lighter you become. You are no longer pulled into the battles of ego and comparison. Instead, you are centered, grounded, and free to live with compassion and wisdom. There comes a point in every seeker's journey where the focus shifts from the self to something larger. You've faced your own mind, battled your own storms, and witnessed the poisons of anger, ill will, and jealousy. But now the question becomes, how do we rise above? How do we live not just for ourselves, but for the whole? The answer lies in compassion, true, boundless compassion. Not pity, not sympathy, but the genuine recognition that every living being shares the same desire, the wish to be free from suffering, the longing for happiness. When you open your heart to this truth, something inside you expands. Suddenly, life is not about protecting your tiny circle of self, but about extending care even to those you may never meet. Compassion is not weakness. It is the highest strength. It takes courage to look at someone who has hurt you and still say, "May you find peace." It takes wisdom to see that those who lash out are often themselves drowning in pain. And it takes a deep inner stability to remain open, even when the world seems to reward hardness and cruelty. But compassion alone is not enough. It needs a higher perspective to guide it. Because without wisdom, compassion can become blind, leading you to exhaust yourself or enable harm. The higher perspective is the ability to see the bigger picture, to rise above the limited view of the ego. It's like standing on a mountain peak. While everyone else is lost in the valley's fog, you see the landscape clearly. From that higher vantage point, you understand that life is not a series of isolated events, but an intricate web where everything is connected. The anger of one person ripples outward, but so does the kindness of another. Every act matters. Every intention plants a seed. And compassion, when paired with perspective, ensures that the seeds you sow are ones of healing, not harm. Think about this. When you cultivate compassion, you don't just give something away, you receive in return. Your heart grows lighter, your mind becomes clearer, and slowly the grip of selfish desire loosens. You begin to experience joy not only when good comes to you, but when good comes to anyone. This is freedom. The Buddha often compared compassion to a mother's love, a love so unconditional that she would sacrifice everything for her child. But the invitation is to extend that same love beyond family, beyond tribe, beyond nation, to all beings without exception. Imagine living like that. Imagine a world where each person wished for the well-being of everyone else. That is not fantasy. It begins with you right here in this moment. When you stand rooted in compassion and guided by higher perspective, you no longer get lost in petty conflicts or fleeting emotions. You rise above, like the lotus that blooms unstained by the mud beneath it. You begin to live as a force of healing in a world that desperately needs it. And in that, you discover something profound. The more compassion you give, the more boundless your life becomes. When you look back at this journey, from the power of the mind to balance, to facing yourself honestly, to cultivating compassion, one truth shines brighter than all others. You are the author of your life. Not fate, not chance, not some distant force controlling your every step. You. Every thought you choose to nurture shapes the way you see the world. Every action you take carves the path beneath your feet. Every emotion you allow to linger writes the next line of your story. Life is not happening to you, it is happening through you. This does not mean you control everything. Storms will still come. People will still act in ways you cannot predict. Loss, pain, and change are part of the human experience. But the way you meet these realities, that is yours to decide. You can meet them with bitterness, or you can meet them with wisdom. You can meet them with fear, or you can meet them with courage. You can choose anger, or you can choose compassion. The Buddha taught that the mind is the forerunner of all things. If you fill your mind with resentment, you create a world of suffering. If you fill your mind with kindness, you create a world of peace. The external may not change overnight, but your perception, the lens through which you experience it all, becomes clear, steady, and radiant. And when that shifts, everything shifts. So ask yourself, what kind of life do you want to create? One ruled by old habits, poisons, and fear, or one infused with presence, balance, compassion, and purpose? The choice is not in some distant future. It is here now in this very breath. You create your life not in grand gestures, but in the small, repeated acts of awareness. In choosing to pause before reacting. In choosing to breathe before speaking. In choosing gratitude when the mind longs to complain. These moments, like drops of water, may seem small, but together they carve rivers. Together, they shape destiny. And as you step forward, remember this: you are not bound by your past. You are not defined by your mistakes. You are not imprisoned by your old stories. You are free right now to write a new one, to begin again, to live as the truest version of yourself. So let these teachings not remain just words you've heard, but seeds planted in the soil of your life. Nurture them with practice. Water them with mindfulness. Protect them with compassion. And watch as they blossom into a life of clarity, strength, and joy. The path is yours. The pen is in your hands. And the story waiting to be written is brighter than you can imagine. Because in the end, the greatest truth is simple. You create your own life. If these words touched your heart, take them with you into your daily life. Let them guide your thoughts, your choices, your relationships. And if this journey has resonated with you, I invite you to join our community here at Zen Buddhism Wisdom. Subscribe to the channel so you can continue walking this path of mindfulness and insight with us. Share this message with someone who may need a moment of peace today. And if you feel called, leave a reflection in the comments, because your words may be the light that helps another. Remember, wisdom grows when it's shared. Compassion deepens when it's practiced. And together, step by step, we can create a life of clarity, balance, and joy. So take a breath, carry this wisdom with you, and never forget, the power to shape your life is already within you.